and welcome back to the Mindful Living Summit. I'm Ann Alexander, and I'm the Content Director of Mindful, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm so happy to be here today with Peter Weng. We're going to explore the idea of well-being and how to use your mindfulness practice to develop your well-being in your life. Peter Weng is the Chief Executive Officer of Healthy Minds Innovation, which is a nonprofit affiliated with the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose mission it is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through the scientific understanding of the mind. Prior to HMI, Peter was the Chief Business Officer at Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, and he spent many years in technology as an executive at Google and Dell while working around the world. Peter, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Ann. It's great to be here.
So let's just jump in. So Peter, to start off, can you talk to us a little bit about your notion of well-being? What is well-being when you think about it?
Yeah, sure, of course. So well-being to us is really important because I think we feel like it's one of the critical things to address given what we've seen as kind of alarming trends on depression and anxiety, stress, loneliness, inability to focus. I mean, those things, the trends are looking really kind of horrific to the point where it feels like it's a public health crisis. They're all going down and across different age groups. And so what we care about from the perspective of well-being is not just kind of attainment of kind of pleasurable experiences, but being able to live in a way that has meaning and is essentially self-realization, basically being able to fully function in life. And I think one of the things that we think about, and one of the things that to us is really exciting, is that as we've explored this and looked at this, it's been demonstrated that well-being is a skill. So well-being is something that we can actually train and cultivate, kind of similar to the way that you can train your body and you can kind of develop your body and the skills that your body has. You can train that for the mind as well. And so well-being is something that can be cultivated. We can actually measure components of it, and we can train aspects of it, and that kind of commit or kind of help us for our overall well-being.
So well-being is a skill. That's a really interesting perspective. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I don't think of well-being as a skill. I think of well-being as kind of almost like a measurement. How are you feeling today? Well, I'm feeling good. My well-being is good. But I don't think of it as a skill. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's funny. Another way that sometimes you may think about it is kind of an inadvertent outcome, right? That, I feel fortunate that I happen to feel good today. But actually, when we've looked at it, and actually one of the things that we've been doing is applying science to looking at kind of the mind and emotions and states. And one of the things that we were able to do is determine that there are four key components of well-being. And again, we can measure them and we can train them. So those four components that we've identified are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose.
So can you tell us about those four components of well-being?
So the four components, again, are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And these kind of constitute the four, what we believe are the kind of key aspects of well-being. Awareness is, starting off with awareness, is kind of paying attention, of being able to notice what's going on in your body, in your mind, kind of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. This also includes meta-awareness, being able to notice what you're paying attention to, right? When you're sitting in class and you weren't paying attention to the professor, and then suddenly you notice you were daydreaming, that's meta-awareness. So mindfulness is a key component of awareness. The ability to kind of bring your attention to the present moment intentionally and fully experience what's happening, that allows us to be aware. And that, we believe, is a foundational, critical thing, is being able to be aware and understand what's happening. So and I think as you'll learn through the summit, mindfulness is a very trainable skill, and so awareness is a trainable kind of skill that we can develop. The next one is connection, and this is approaching your relationships with others in a spirit of kindness and compassion. So we often have kind of different presets that we may have learned and ingrained over our life in the way that we interact with people, and we can actually cultivate different ways of connecting with others. The example that I like to give is, I grew up in the Northeast, and my preset is to be distrustful of everybody I don't know very well. And I noticed that more recently, that that is my preset, and actually I can work on that. And when I interact with a stranger, I don't necessarily need to think that they're an evil person or a threat. And so there are ways to work on connection. The third is insight. And insight we look at examining our own perspective, using a spirit of curiosity and looking at the way that we look at the world, the way that we think, the narratives that we use. Again, a lot of times we have developed very potentially rigid and simplistic ways of making assessments and judgments. And an insight, we want to go and explore those. Are they actually true? Are they helpful for us? Are they helpful for others? And then the last component is purpose, of really trying to stay connected to kind of meaning and value in life, and examining that and what has meaning for us, and can we stay connected to it as we go about our daily life? Can we see how different things that we do throughout our day actually contribute and are supportive of our purpose? And so those four components, we have different ways of actually measuring each one, and we have different skills for which we can then go and cultivate each aspect.
So let me get that straight. So it's awareness, connection, insight, and purpose.
Yes.
All right. Wow. Okay. And so how do we go about, as you were saying, how do we go about our daily lives and strengthen and develop those?
So in each area, there are you can think of different practices that you can do. And there are different, you can do dedicated practices where, you could, for example, we're talking about mindfulness training. You can practice mindfulness, for example, in a sitting meditation practice. You can actually do that for connection and insight and purpose as well. So you can do dedicated practices where you are deliberately training. And this, if we use the analogy to kind of physical training, this is like going to the gym, right? Basically, you are working on a skill and you're developing and increasing your capacity. So this would be like strength training or cardio training. You can practice these in a dedicated way. We can also integrate these practices into our life. You can take little aspects of all of these pieces and then integrate them become kind of small habits and small ways of living. I'll give you an example. Our founder is Dr. Richard Davidson, who was one of the pioneering neuroscientists he was the one or one of the first people who thought of connecting monks, long-term practitioners, to kind of, MRIs and EEGs and determining that, meditation and mindfulness practice has a physiological change on the body. One of his practices that I really like is when he looks at his calendar each morning to determine what he's going to do, he thinks about how can I help these people? In what way can I kind of bring kindness to these folks that I'm going to be meeting with today? Another example that I like to do, again, I mentioned I grew up in Boston, in the Boston area, and my friends actually that I grew up with, it's very strange. I didn't grow up in a very rough town, but my friends, they love to fight. They like the physical fist fights all the time, every weekend, and there's a kind of default of direct aggressive confrontation, and I've found as I've worked around the world that is not appropriate in many cultures, and so right when I hit a point of conflict now, maybe it's a disagreement on some work topic or maybe it's a personal topic, I quickly do a body scan, which is one of the practices that you can practice when you're meditating. I do a very fast version to try to identify, okay, how am I feeling right now? And what emotions are coming up for me, which then, and typically or very often I will find, okay, I'm feeling mad. And then what this does is allow me to then think, okay, am I thinking through this in a way that seems fair and healthy, right? What are my thoughts right now? And what are the ways that I'm kind of viewing this issue that is at hand? And so kind of the drills of doing the meditation on the cushion, then I use that skill very quickly when I'm kind of in a situation in real life to then kind of prompt me to go down this path of exploring these different aspects of well-being.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that your mindfulness practice it just sort of underpins all of these. It gives you the awareness, it sounds like, to sort of be regularly aware of how you're doing on these various 4 skills. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we absolutely view it as foundational.
And do you have like a daily check-in, or sort of like so you're sort of saying, well, how am I doing with my awareness, or how am I doing with my connection? How am I doing on my insight, and am I tracking with my sense of purpose? Do you have kind of almost an inventory that you keep regularly for these 4 pillars?
So I roughly track them. I don't necessarily track all 4 every day, but I have a regular meditation practice where I'll kind of like cycle through these and kind of work on developing them. Then I will, again, kind of try to integrate them into the way that I normally live. I also journal every day, and then where I try to evaluate how I'm doing. In fact, I have my journal with me. I thought it might be funny to show. This is actually my journal. It's a little bit. The writing is very small, which is, I think, this is my daily tracker, which I think people often laugh about. But what this is a month. This is a month of my life. I track every day, and there's a set of things that I track to see how I'm doing. And then at the end of each month, and the reason I like to do it like this with the small writing is that I can see a whole month all at once. And there's a number of different things that I track. And at the end of the month, I can track to see, am I living in the way that I would hope to live? And sometimes I find I'm not, right? So there are, and so I do track things of kind of interactions. I also track some very basic mundane things, like what time I go to sleep at night. I'm a surfer. Did I go surfing? I have a lot of different other ridiculous hobbies, and did I do them? Did I not do them? Did I do them in the frequency that I would hope for in my life? And then periodically, kind of in the kind of probably once or twice a month, I do more normal journaling. This is kind of the more normal sized text where I kind of do reflections and I see how am I doing? Do I feel like things are tracking to the way that I feel good about? This is probably where I spend more time, examining purpose and checking in to see how I'm doing. So I do track regularly.
So that's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your journal.
And I hope the resolution isn't good enough to be able to read it, but
No, we're going to see if you were doing, how much surfing you're doing. No, I think that's wonderful, because it sounds like what you're saying is you're intentionally sort of sifting through, whether it's a daily basis or just kind of on a reflective basis. How are you doing on these various measures, which just kind of brings them to sort of a heightened awareness, and that sort of sifts through your day or sort of influences your day. And I would imagine it might be that you have an awareness, like, oh, that feels like that's related to my purpose. So you're bringing these sort of ideas to sort of a higher level of consciousness in how you navigate and how you live your day.
Yeah, and it's really surprising sometimes when these types of reflections. There are times where I've been really surprised at how. Sometimes I'm really happy. Sometimes I look at it and I'm like, oh, wow, that was a really great month, and I feel like I'm really living in alignment with kind of the goals that I set out. And other times I'm really surprised that I'm not, and I didn't even notice it. One thing that really struck me is I just did a pie chart of kind of how I spend my time. And it's interesting to do this and think about your own self-image. When I was younger, when I was in my early 20s, I kind of geared my life around surfing, and I calculated in the summer, I was working full time, but I used to surf 30 hours a week. And this is in addition to a full-time job, right? I was a research engineer. And so for a long time, it's been part of in my self-image that I am a surfer. But I did a pie chart, and I live in the Midwest now. I have to drive an hour and a half to go surf on Lake Michigan. And I realized, the percentage of my time that I spent surfing is very small now. And so it was very interesting to understand kind of things that are in my mind versus what is actually true in reality. And how else am I spending my time? So it's really been interesting to take a look at that.
That sounds fascinating. That sounds like just such a valuable exercise, because the fact that you think about yourself as one way, and then when you actually look at the activities that you're doing, they might be different. Or even just I love the idea of setting sort of a clear set of intentions, and you've sort of outlined those 4 pillars that underscore well-being, and just to be aware of how are those showing up, and how are you showing up in your own life. That's fascinating. So just switching gears for a sec, in terms of your work at HMI, can you talk a little bit about how your work focuses on creating kinder, wiser, more compassionate world by helping people be supported in cultivating their own well-being? How does that work?
Sure. There's a number of we have kind of 3 big streams of work that we're trying to do to help support people develop kind of overall well-being. One is an accessible manner. What we've tried to do is, we've tried to encapsulate all of these, the scientific findings from the neuroscience lab here, and then kind of this theoretical work with the framework. And we've spent several years developing this into a kind of curriculum. So one of the things we've done is actually we've created an app. So we've put kind of the 4 pieces of the framework in an app. Actually, here's a screenshot of it. It's the Healthy Minds program. And what we've actually done is we've decided recently that we want to make this really accessible. So we've decided to make this freely available. And it's now available just for anybody to use freely. We do accept donations. We are a nonprofit, but we've decided to make the app freely available to allow people to use it. It's basically a kind of a extended training of the 4 components of well-being. We also have a whole stream of work around measures, where we are looking to develop better and novel measures of well-being. So I mentioned, all of these different components can be measured, but some of them, the measurements are very painful and laborious. They're very tedious tasks that we pay people in a laboratory to test them on, and so what we're trying to do is make things very accessible. So for example, attention, sustained attention, there are some standardized tests for that are very, very boring. We are actually we're working with a video game company, and we're developing a video game to measure one of the same aspects of sustained attention that is done in the lab. We are also working on different types of passive measures that allow us to collect information. And so one of the things that we're doing, and one of the purposes of the app, is kind of an attempt to spread this work widely and then have everybody participate, kind of a citizen science model, where everybody can help contribute to our knowledge and understanding of what contributes to well-being. And then the third big component we do is we have a bunch of organizational engagements. We work with some large organizations as they want to explore well-being, either from an organizational level or from kind of their services and products level.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's interesting. And so the app the app you said is free and it's available now?
Yes, it is available now. Yeah, it's freely available. It's on the App Store, within kind of the iPhone world, or on the Google Play Store, and yeah, we really want people to just have access to it.
Great. And so it sounds like the more the merrier. The more people that download it, it sounds like you're also gathering that data. You're using the app as well to gather data about more components of well-being, or?
Yes, so the app has built in an assessment. So there's a self-assessment that it's called the Healthy Minds Index, and it's a validated assessment that we've created, and then pops up periodically throughout the use of the app. Over time. I think 28 or 30-day intervals are what we have it set for, and so we can track to see how, and actually users can track how they're progressing. And one of the things that we're doing is then integrating this across the board to see how do we, at an aggregate level rather than an individual level, look at how well-being progresses.
Wonderful. Let me ask you another question, because you've talked a little bit about kindness and we were talking a little bit about wisdom and compassion. How does well-being connect with kindness, wisdom, and compassion?
I think one of the really important things is thinking about kind of how we relate to others and how we relate within our community. Right? So again, if I think about overall well-being, one of the things that is really striking is how important social connection is. So I think people often think about health issues, like physical health issues like obesity or smoking. And actually loneliness is a huge indicator of physical kind of ill-being. And so we view this as really important, that kindness and compassion and wisdom really contributes to allow us to connect with others in a much more positive way, allowing us to engage in a way that is meaningful and fulfilling rather than challenging and draining. This brings to mind to me something interesting. So, one of the measures we do of looking at, for example, kind of like kindness and our predisposition to that, is looking at how we look at neutral strangers, right? And again, I mentioned, my disposition coming from the Northeast is everyone is, bad except for my close friends. And so there actually is a test for this. There's a standardized test that looks at, it's called positive person construal. If you look at a neutral face, how likely are you to view it as, as a positive or friendly versus negatively? And so practices that we work on, right, are kindness and compassion practices that we can work on, meditations and active practices on this, actually can help us shift that, and we can shift to become more positive.
So if we're feeling maybe lonely or disconnected from community, it sounds like if you can sort of increase your sense of compassion, increase your sense of connection, maybe even feel a greater disposition towards kindness towards strangers, is what you're saying that helps usher us into a greater sense of community and connection, or a greater willingness to connect with people around us?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It does. It actually does two things, right? So one is when we're actually engaging with people, right, we can kind of help reset kind of our baseline to have us be more predisposed to that. It can also help us even when we're not with people, in that the way that we kind of think about, like, I think it's a very common thing to, think about others, think about our relationships with others, and then the way that we think about them and the narratives that we use. And so, I was thinking about this as, we're right now from a timeliness perspective, right, where there's the challenges with the coronavirus, and we're kind of going to have mandated social distancing, and we can actually work on even when we're not interacting with people, kind of our relationships with others, and thinking about the narratives that we have, the stories that we have, the perceptions that we hold of kind of our interest versus their interest. So there's a number of different things that we can work on.
So that's really interesting. So what you're saying is, even when we're not actually physically in community with people, when we're not actually physically interacting or even just having a conversation, whether it's a virtual or not, how we think about community and how we think about connection influences our well-being.
Yes, absolutely.
That's very, very interesting. That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about, because it sounds like with your company, you go in and you work with organizations. So what have you learned about how organizations can change their culture or cannot maybe change their culture in terms of bringing some of these aspects of well-being into how they work?
So one of the things that I find really interesting is that it really takes a fairly wide set of skills to change. It's not just kind of one strong emphasis. So the thing that really strikes me, because I've been working with many different organizations over the past several years, and I've personally worked in a number of different organizations. And one of the things that I find very interesting is that it requires kind of it requires common language, common agreements, as well as the positive intention. All of those have to kind of fit together. The thing that really strikes me is one of the nicest organizations I worked with in terms of like everyone was very nice there. It was interesting that they didn't have kind of the common agreements and all of the things in place. So actually some of the meanest things that you can think of like in a work environment would happen there in terms of broken commitments, of not holding up to their word and really what I would call like dastardly behavior. But actually it was not done with dastardly intention. It was because there was a focus on just trying to be nice at whoever was kind of in interaction right at that moment and not holding these other values kind of highly enough. So it actually requires a balance, which is actually, and it's very interesting, it aligns very well to kind of our well-being framework of kind of, there's a skill around awareness. There's also a desire for connection and trying to make sure that relationships are preserved. But there's also an insight in being able to understand kind of and look at interactions as they're occurring and what's really important, and an alignment to values and purpose. Right, so for an example that example, staying aligned to commitments and accountability, and those things are equally important to the relationship, and keeping them all in mind rather than just focusing on the interaction that's at hand right at the moment. So it actually requires a set of things together. One of the things I remember that was the most effective is an organization that I worked in, and we had all made an agreement as this was a far-ranging executive team. We were all kind of leading different. I was in mainland China. It was Asia Pacific, Latin America kind of leadership team, and so we all had teams across the world. We all made an agreement, and we said if we have a disagreement between the two of us, and we need to go to kind of the group level, large organizational leader, we will do that together. I will not go behind your back and then go and pitch against you, and no one else is going to do that to me either. We will do this together and jointly. And so it kind of honors kind of many aspects together. And so that's one of the things that I found has been really interesting, that you actually have to have things in balance.
It sounds like you have to have things in balance, and it sounds like they have to be like, you have to have that level of awareness to say, these are our values. So we value honesty in this case, or trust, or clear communication. It's fine to disagree, but you want to be able to disagree in a way that is known. It's not, you're not going around the houses and sort of having those conversations. That's fascinating. So it sounds like in order to sort of successfully navigate that, you have to have agreement around a certain set of values, you've said, or principles of how you interact with each other.
Yes, I think that's what really allows an organization to really thrive and work together in a, it's truly, it goes beyond like personal trust, but kind of at an organizational trust level.
And it sounds like the reverse of that is also true. So in terms of some of the difficulties that you've encountered in trying to bring more well-being into an office, I mean, I love your idea of like it sounds like unwitting, dastardly behavior. What are some of the other difficulties you might have encountered?
So that one to me I thought was the funniest, because that was the most surprising, right? Like, you get a group of super nice people, you think, oh, that's an easy win, right? I think the more common situation, though, is of kind of unchecked kind of aggression and unknowing kind of harm that's created. And this is interesting enough in the sense that I feel like this is very prevalent in the workplace. It's also very prevalent in personal life and at home, right? Of people not being aware of the damage that they're causing from their actions. And this is where it comes down to a very personal level as well, of looking at kind of personal development around awareness, of being aware of, and as you're starting to have an emotional reaction, can you see that that's what you're doing? And then the connection portion and remembering that actually this is another person there, right? This is not some faceless, heartless thing that you're hitting. And then the insight to examine, right? Am I coming at this with only my perspective, and how am I doing this in a way that is either constructive or destructive? And then trying to then also stay connected to overall what is really important to me here. What is the big goal that I have, either as an organizational level or, at home with my family, what is really important to me, or with my friends, what is really important? And so kind of keeping all of those in mind.
So that sounds like that, as you said, that can be really important, as an organization committing to have that kind of transparency and emotional awareness. But it also sounds like it's really important for an individual to have that kind of personal emotional awareness. So they're aware of what their intentions are, what's happening in their body. Can you talk a little bit more just specifically for folks who are tuning in and listening? What are some of the ways that they can get started, sort of bringing these attributes of well-being more into their life? Or if they're perhaps, further into their mindfulness practice, how can they start to integrate some of these elements into their daily lives?
Sure. I think, obviously starting off with some form of dedicated practice would be ideal. I think, and I would recommend just, if someone's just starting off, to just start off in a very small doses, right? I think there will be a number of practices that are being taught throughout the summit, and to use some of these kind of on a daily basis to just carve out time and just spend a little time of doing them. Then to think about what I like to do. I got really harshed on once. It wasn't actually harsh, but it was very funny. I was at a meditation retreat, and I asked a question, and it was a very serious retreat. People were like going through lots of really challenging things, but there was a space, and I was like, no one's asking a question, I'll ask a question. And I said, I've been trying to optimize my meditations, and so I do, awareness practice in the morning, and then I do compassion practice in the evening, and I do that on the weekdays. On the weekends, I only do, awareness practice, and so I'm wondering, is that the right set? And the teacher, he knew me, but he looked at me and he said, "Are you an engineer?" And the whole group laughed at me, and it was very funny. But so I feel like that's maybe not necessary to that degree, but to just have a small start and just to try to start building these into daily life, right? First thing in the morning for a minute or 5 minutes, or right before going to sleep, or I have a friend who's a young parent, and for her, the time she uses is right as she drives home. Before she gets out of the car, she spends a couple minutes of meditation practice. And then I like to try to set intentions, right, as I think about things that I want to work on, right? And it's actually very similar, again, the physical analogy, right? For sports, like setting up, what skills you want to work on, I like to think about that. And then I like to, try to pay attention, and that's the kind of thing that I would like to track, right? Am I doing well? If I'm working on, again, I keep going back to this, and I'm going to come across as like a really mean person, but right, like expressing like anger and frustration at work. That used to be a very common problem for me. That it's the way I grew up, and I also worked in areas and companies that was very socially acceptable. And so when I wanted to try to shift that, I actually had to set a lot of attention to it. And so then, trying to integrate those skills at the moment, but then also reflecting afterwards to say, am I doing well, and how is that going? So kind of tracking regularly and going through the process of looking at, am I making progress? If not, should I shift the focus a little more? Are there other things that I need to do? Some of it, I realized some of them were actually very basic, right? Maybe I should not stay up late because I'm cranky if I don't, and just kind of slowly tracking.
Peter, I can't imagine you. I think you've obviously been so successful in your work. The idea of you being this aggressive, sort of with like growing up around this kind of go-to aggressive behavior, you seem like you've been very successful in shedding those behavior patterns, because now they sound like funny stories rather than your sort of go-to tool set.
No, I hope that's true universally, but it does feel like, when I think back, and actually this is an interesting thing when I look back at my journal, I will say, geez, boy, I used to have a lot of problems. Like this used to come up very regularly. So.
Well, it sounds like you've also developed, I love your engineering aspect, that you've got these different tools, your month grid, your journal, that you have an awareness about certain areas that you want to focus on, and you not only are intentional about that, but you're also reflective about it and saying, well, did I or didn't I? Let me just go back and check. I mean, even the number of hours you're surfing, you have a very sort of almost like a self-inventory way of life to sort of say, this is what I'm going for and this is how am I doing. That's marvelous. And so it sounds like with well-being, those 4 pillars, awareness, connection, insight, purpose, are things that people can, just help cultivate on a regular basis in order to achieve that state of well-being.
Yes, absolutely. And it actually occurs to me, I should mention also, when we were just talking about kind of daily practice and things to do, I mentioned earlier that we have developed the app, the Healthy Minds program. The app also has the option of active practices. So it has not just kind of, guidance around, sit down and we'll focus on and guide you in this practice, but it has active practices to say, while you're doing other activities, how can you try to, for example, increase your level of awareness while you're, doing whatever you're doing, mowing the lawn or, folding laundry, and just kind of, it has both in there. And so that's another way that you can try to just build it into your kind of daily life.
That's really nice. That sounds like a lovely way to apply mindfulness in your everyday life. All right, so speaking of applying mindfulness and practicing, you have been so generous and you've shared so many insights and wisdom in your experience. Would you also be kind enough to lead us through a practice, just a short practice, so we can begin to incorporate some of these elements of well-being?
Yes, of course. Why don't we do a short kind of combo of awareness and connection practice. And I invite everyone to kind of sit in a way that allows you to feel comfortable, alert, but relaxed. You can close your eyes if you want, or you can keep them open. I'd recommend averting your gaze down with a soft focus. Why don't we just take several deep breaths just to settle in. And then resuming normal breathing. I invite you to just notice if anything is happening in your body right now. Just take a quick assessment and just notice how your body feels right now. And I ask you to also see if you can observe, is it possible to observe what thoughts are arising for you, what thoughts are coming to you as you're sitting. I'd also ask you to explore emotions. Are there any emotions that are present for you right now? Just noticing what emotions that you may be experiencing right now, or if none, noticing the lack of a feeling of emotion. But just notice any emotions. Now I'd like to do a little exploration around kindness. And let's think about kindness to ourselves. What do you do that brings you kind of a feeling of meaning that you find enriching? So think about some small thing that you do that you find meaningful and enriching. And I'd ask you to think about how can you do that one thing sometime this week. And let's consider kindness to others. I'd like you to think about someone that you care about and offering kindness to them. Can you think of some small way that you can show them kindness? I'd like you to imagine how they would feel upon receiving this. And think about how you will feel upon taking this action. I encourage you to consider, is there a way that you can do this action this week? And now let's just go back and do a quick check. And notice again, what's going on in the body? How does your body feel right at this moment? Can you notice any thoughts that are arising? And any emotions that might be present. All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much. Such a generous, beautiful practice. Really appreciate that. So thank you. I just want to say thank you again for all the wisdom and the ideas and the insights that you've shared with us today. Really very, very, very grateful for that. And also, so thank you for your participation today, and thank you to everybody who's been participating in this Mindful Living Summit. Hope you have a wonderful and beautiful day.